Hey, it's Christian. So I think there's just a lot to unpack with the meaning crisis and how that's played out, at least for me, over the last 7 to 8 years. And if you watched my first video, I talked about 2016 kind of being the seminal year of kind of the meaning crisis and rebirth in my life. And so I'm going to kind of talk about I don't know the credits here other than Jordan Peterson for that meaning is nested in story. I don't know if that's a Joseph Campbell or a Jungian thing, but he is the one that obviously put clarity to that idea for me. I remember the first time I heard him talking about that, he said that um, Western civilization, the substrate of Western civilization is based on a story. And at the time, I was in nursing school taking anatomy and physiology, and I was learning about biochemistry, that what the substrate, how it holds together like two enzymes. And I thought, oh, that's really interesting. So I had this like picture literally in a textbook of this word substrate as he's talking about it. And it's so this thing is being held together like these pieces or the civilization. It's like the um, girding, underlying strength or connection for the whole thing. And interestingly, during that time, I was no longer doing ministry. I was in nursing school, and I was trying to kind of, you know, wrestle with a new identity. And I didn't know how much of that identity I wanted to be Christian or ministry-ish or anything like that. But I found myself in a friendship with a young man who had been Jehovah's Witness and had been captured by the story of New Atheism, like Richard Dawkins and the like. And it had brought him out of Jehovah's Witness. And so, if you know anything about that group, once you leave, they have like a shunning principle. So he was kind of on his own. He was 18 at the time and trying to go through school, and he was studying science to considering doing pre-med. And so we were taking some of the same classes, and he was brilliant. This kid was brilliant. He could like put together these physiological concepts, quickly. I would like spend hours, and he would just, there they were in his brain. Brilliant kid. And so we would start having conversations, and I was kind of known as the smarty in my little cohort, and I was doing some tutoring, and we start kind of touching on other topics like religion and science and atheism. And it was, it was wild because I had spent the previous like 6 years, 7 years just really looking at these stories, watching these debates. And here we were at this crux in 2017. And, a lot of these things are kind of breaking down, but these stories are still powerful. And I remember we had like a 6-hour conversation one day in this tutoring center about truth, science, reality, religion. And of course, he was very hurt, to say the least, by religion. But it had played a very powerful role in his life. And so I think there was still this, this foundational aspect to his person. And then, of course, he was listening to Jordan Peterson and some of the IDW people. And so we kind of were coming together on those points. But as I was trying to communicate like why I believed this, and it was really based around story. And we had a part of a conversation, and it kind of, I don't know, maybe somebody had said this before. I don't know. I like to think it was original, but it's not. Sorry, I had to take a water break so I wouldn't annoy you guys forever. So I start telling him I think that like secular humanism is not self-evident, that it has to have like a story that it's nested in. You have to have atheism, and you have to have um like Darwinian evolution for secular humanism to kind of work, and that it's just another story. And these are the narratives that surround it. And that when it's like the holy trinity of atheism. And I think that did stick with him. It stuck with me because I was just like, where did that come from? I think it came from Jordan Peterson, the ingestment of such things. And that's when I began to think that it was so powerful. And along that time, there were the Pangburn series coming out, and I was, anticipating the Sam Harris, Jordan Peterson conversations. And, Sam had these gotcha, or not Sam, Jordan had these gotcha moments with BBC News and whatnot. These really powerful things. And I think that one thing I didn't really mention as I was reflecting on my last video, was that Jordan doesn't just play this patron saint archetype, but he kind of plays the king archetype. Like, who will fight for us? And, here was this guy going to battle in a way and winning in areas that people of faith had not for a long time won, like decisively. And, as I'm watching Peterson talk to Sam, and they're talking about objective truth, and he kind of had this gotcha moment where he made, I don't remember what Sam Harris pulled religion out of the magic hat, I don't remember how it's put, but they're talking about what is objectively wrong, like the greatest good and the greatest evil. And Jordan Peterson says, well, what you're describing sounds a lot like heaven and hell. And if you have like any, if you read Lewis's Great Divorce at some point in your life, you're like, that makes total sense. And Sam's trying to do it in this scientific, like, we can have objective measures, and, and again, I'm not even talking about what he's been doing presently, which is a whole nother conversation. I'm kind of walking through the back, like my perspective on this little corner and the like. But Sam is telling the story, he's trying to tell it in these terms that sound rational and scientific. But at the end of the day, we're like talking about heaven and hell. And I think, as a personal note for me, like theologically, that's even just reading The Great Divorce a couple of times as a younger man, and that my perspectives on those had changed a lot to that point where you're either like, you are like heading like in one direction or the other. And it doesn't start with when you die. It starts like today or 10 years ago. And that was, a powerful gotcha in that sense, because it's like, oh, it's the typical, the scientist and the rabbi get to the top of the mountain and the priest is there, God's there, or whatever. And it's like, you're like, all these things that you're trying to discover have already been discovered. They're just had been wrapped in something that people didn't know how to take in, or it had lost its power somewhere along the way. And, I think that maybe some of that is due to maybe film, because for me, like Star Wars was one of the most powerful stories that I ever experienced as a young person. Um, and, you know, it's kind of a trigger word now with what's going on with Star Wars, but I don't really even care about the new Star Wars stuff. Um, that story, that hero's journey, these things, these visual mediums and had come into play, and they carried a lot of power and a lot of meaning for young men and women. Um, and I think that the church didn't know how to like reconcile that in a lot of ways. And now there's just so much integration happening. But Star Wars is a story. Atheism is a story. It's not, just a rejection of God. It's a story of that rejection, of your experience, of these other tenets, Darwinian evolution, secular humanism, atheism, and as the Christianity is a story. And I just happen to believe that it's a better story. And I think that's interesting because here you have Jordan Peterson in 2017 or 18, whenever it was, talking about meaning being nested in story. And the tagline for the recent ARC conference was "Tell a better story." And I think that's true. Or else a lesser one will take its place. And we've seen it. We're experiencing it in so many ways. That if you're halfway interested in this video, I don't even have to talk about. But if you watched my previous video, I was talking about how the story of Abraham had a dramatic and deliberate impact on my life. And I think, that's one of those stories that like atheism sometimes would take and just like, look at this child sacrifice and how wretched and awful this old archaic religion is. And for me, in the moment where that story had a massive impact, it painted a picture of understanding. It mapped the symbol of what was taking place, mapped on to my experience in the 21st century, that to follow God's way, which I believe is truth, I had to be willing to sacrifice my family, which means that the truth of something sad and something terrible might cause it to die, at least in the way that it was. Yet I had to be willing to do that, to follow what was right, to live in truth. And that all made sense to me. And that's a 4,000-year-old story, like, or 3, whatever it is. Like, how? And it wasn't a story of a young boy in a desert who, was trying to understand his father and got a laser sword. Like, that didn't help me. It wasn't knowing that, that creation happened in 6 days or 7 days versus, several million years. That didn't help me. But a man who had been called by God, who was trying and failed many times to do so, comes to a point in his life where God's calling him to do something absolutely terrifying that doesn't seem to make sense to him. Yet he is going to believe. He's going to trust God. And on the surface, God would ask anybody to, sacrifice their kid. Seems crazy. But I felt like I had experience in my life where God was calling me to place my family on the altar, so to speak. And that story gave me the courage to trust that the truth was better and the consequences thereof were better, regardless of what was going to happen, even if my family broke apart. So stories are powerful, and in that I began to find so much meaning in my life. And I actually think, and I would encourage anybody watching this, if you haven't ever read C.S. Lewis's Great Divorce, especially if you're a Christian, to kind of get a different framing for heaven and hell, because maybe the ideas of heaven and hell were ones that like pushed you away from your faith. But I think it's actually a pretty good story about the choices that we make and about the life we live. And one of the pieces of that has to do in the Lord's Prayer, when it says, "Your kingdom come and your will be done on earth as it is in heaven." Like it's like heaven and hell are happening today. It's not just when you take your last breath. And that the choices we make lead us in those directions. And so, and we could get into theological arguments about justification versus sanctification, and I'm not here for that. I'm just here to say that stories are powerful and that there is deep meaning in stories. And that's one reason that I say go to church if you're a Christian, or even if you're not, but and have your kids learn stories, because they carry unbelievably powerful messages and power in them. So that's what I want to say about that.